Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand.
If you build for the tastemakers of the world, usually that also means that you're eventually making what I call like the gray matter developers also happy. It trickles down to the rest of the market.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, I get to nerd out about a topic that I'm really curious and passionate about: developer experiences. If your product or part of your product is consumed by developers at your customers, whether they're APIs, SDKs, or other building blocks, it's really important that we empathize with those customer developers using techniques like human-centered design, and we apply intentionality in our experimentation and prioritizing our roadmap so that those customer developers are really delighted and they come back and use your APIs and SDKs a lot more. My guest today is Kenneth Auchenberg, who is an expert in the space. I really love reading all of his material and listening to his stuff. He's worked on multiple products that are developer favorites, like VS Code at Microsoft and Stripe. Kenneth is also an active investor and advisor to a number of startups focused on the platform and developer experience space. We get to talk about some of the differences between platform companies and infrastructure companies, the difference between DevRel and DevX, or developer relations and developer experience, and some of the important principles to consider when designing and delivering a really delightful developer experience. We love the conversation so much and nerded out so deep that we went long, and we have decided to split it up into 2 episodes. On the one you're listening to, we get to hear about Kenneth's experience working in platforms and on developer-centric products, his insights from working at companies like Stripe, and helping build VS Code at what he calls the new Microsoft. In next week's episode, 2 of 2, we'll get to hear about Kenneth's advanced technique advice on building platforms, like the use of abstraction ladders and making sure that you have a really strong developer experience insight that flows into your roadmap and to your product, and how the future of platforms and infrastructure is going to change as generative AI and AI proliferate further into our product development and into our products. One of the things I did want to mention is that we use the term platform primitives quite a lot, and we don't define it till later in the show. Platform primitives are some of the fundamental, low-level, and highly reusable building blocks of a platform. Think about them like Lego blocks that can be used for things like authentication and authentication. Think about as some of the fundamental Lego blocks that can be used for things like authentication and authorization, data storage and retrieval, and provide some of the really essential services upon which your developers or your customer developers can build much more complex features and applications. I had a lot of fun learning a lot more about DevX and delighting customers who are engineers or developers. If you're a product manager designing and prioritizing a developer experience, or you're an engineer building one of the SDKs or APIs, I'm sure you will learn a lot too. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app, or hit that like button on YouTube. Kenneth, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This is great to be here.
So let's talk about platforms. I think maybe start with some definitions to get started, because I've tended to struggle with when people call something a platform, my spidey senses go off, and I tend to want to know a little bit more to determine, is this really a platform or is it single purpose and so forth? So you're the expert here. Tell us how you might define it, or what questions you might ask to see if something really is a platform in your understanding.
I think like in this day and age, everything is kind of a platform, right? And that means, and when everything is a platform, nothing really is. I'm a strong believer in the Bill Gates kind of definition of a platform. that is really comes down to like economic value. And to kind of paraphrase Gates, is like a platform is a product or something is a platform when the compounded like economic value for all the involved parties are greater than the cost it takes to build it. And this is really about like platform is truly about ecosystem building and building like multi-sided marketplaces and enabling the compounding economic value of activity happening in one place. And I think a lot of companies, when they are building infrastructure, they want to say that they're a platform, but in the sense that they're just an infrastructure provider, they're not a platform because there's no network effects. There's no compounding economic value happening. And I think when you Google like Bill Gates and then the quote, I think you can see a lot of stories about like him having some spicy takes on Facebook and other kind of places that in his definition, like this is not a platform. So I'm definitely a strong believer in that, but I think it could be fun for us to kind of dive into like what the differences are between like platform and infrastructure and what it means to be building with something and building on something. And those are the ways that I'm kind of like distinguishing the differences.
Yeah, we've already got an example here of infrastructure companies. And if you were maybe going into an infrastructure company and helping them transition into a platform, let's maybe talk about that and do the differentiation that way.
I think like if you back up a little, like why do you want to build a platform? How do you get there as a company, right? I think the classic journey and the classic framework is that you go from like single product, multi-product, and you probably want to do like a platform play. And like for infrastructure companies, a classic B2B companies, I think the chronicle examples everyone are using is a company like Salesforce that is really about like providing core services around some core data and some core objects, but they really enable that ecosystem around them with the primitives they're providing as a part of that platform. If you think about like Salesforce today as a company, they got famous of building up like the app exchange and really enabling an ecosystem of third-party providers or ISVs, independent software vendors, to be building for their platform. And in return for building with the Salesforce platform, you would get distribution and all these awesome things. And that's really where like the elements of like you providing platform primitives and you couple that with the other side of the coin that is the ecosystem in terms of like you get distribution, you get monetization, you get marketing, etc. So from a company perspective, why do you want to end up in that journey instead of just building all your product in-house? Why do you want like to have an ecosystem building with you? It's really about like the long tail as you kind of like are growing up and you expanding your value proposition. Is that at a certain point in time you can no longer just be building yourself for your ISPs the ICPs, because your customer profiles is changing and you're reaching a larger and larger part of the market. So really what you want to enable is a different way of leverage and a different way of scaling. And you usually do that by enabling your third party ecosystem around you to be building with you and serving your customers that is becoming their customers. And a saying that I have is that like building platforms is really about like giving up control and applying like leverage in strategic places. I think it's very natural when you are building a product, in particular if you take like a lot of pride in the craft you're applying to your products, and you want to assert as much control as possible. You want to control the landing page, the branding, every single pixel, etc. But the journey of you becoming a platform is really starting to giving up that control in very strategic places. It's like, okay, maybe there's one part of my product I want other people to be building. Maybe there's like other aspects that, okay, it's not really core to me, so I want to outsource those business opportunities to my ecosystem instead. But I also think that's probably where a lot of companies are getting things wrong, in the sense that they're actually not ready to give up that control. They actually don't want to run a platform with everything that entails and all the complexities and all the mess that it creates. They just want to be a strong product company that is offering their product as an infrastructure, maybe via APIs, and to really assert all the control.
what are some great companies that come to mind if you were to think of a great infrastructure company that's kind of picked that swim lane and doing it well, and then maybe contrast that to a great platform company?
I think like a company that actually does both things really, really well is probably AWS and Amazon, in the sense that Amazon providing really strong platform primitives, in terms of like S3 compute abstractions, etc. But what they've also enabled on top is the AWS marketplace that is really enabling like their customers to provide AWS specific functionality, and then they're enabling the distribution of that functionality to all the AWS customers. So to me, that's a really great example of a company that's really started by really being focused on infrastructure and primitives that really started to leverage the ecosystem they have on top of them. Another like a more modern company would be Shopify. I think Shopify is a classic like B2B kind of company that have enabled a really strong ecosystem on top of their platform with them. And to me, like Shopify is a true platform in the sense that I think I can't remember the numbers on top of my head, but the average merchant that is using Shopify is also using a certain number of apps to be successful. So really, like if you sign up and run a store on Shopify, you use a built-in functionality built by Shopify themselves, but you also rely on a lot of functionality provided by the ecosystem as apps you have to install, or you are installing because you want to customize and tailor things. So that's a really great example of like them enabling opportunities in their ecosystem, while keeping their focus and saying, okay, these are the areas where we want to assert control and keep the leverage, but there's all these other opportunities that's not core to our business, therefore we give them to the ecosystem. There's a lot of other companies that are frankly just great infrastructure providers, providing strong APIs, whether it's like to do payments or like sending emails, etc. But the vast majority of companies are not true platform providers, or like a true, like they don't have a true platform with the ecosystem on top of them. And I think like the most canonical example of like a platform is actually Windows. If you go back in time, like Windows was a very, very successful platform because it truly enabled developers to have all batteries included with the Win32 APIs to be truly providing like the foundation of other companies to be building on top of that platform. But it also helped with distribution, security, all these other aspects.
You spent some time at Microsoft.
I did. Yeah. I had a stint from 16, joining Microsoft, being part of like the new generation under Satya.
Tell us about some of the things that maybe you learned there that you would want to bring to the next thing you're working on, or you advise to the founders that you get to work closely with.
I think one of the things, so I originally joined on the product side in the developer tooling division, and I originally joined Microsoft to look after the JavaScript tools and the JavaScript strategy. Back then was when Microsoft was still like new to the open source journey, etc. And that was kind of like the generation that was doing a larger pivot. And I ended up building like a few developer tools like Visual Studio Code and a few other things for them. That was incredibly fun. And it was a fun journey of like being able to work with a brand like Microsoft and really show the world that Microsoft could be relevant again. And back then we were doing a lot of like of the playbook is like, what would old Microsoft do? Let's do things differently and really show that we could do development in the open. We could leverage open source. And then through my time, like with some of the work we all did, like VS Code became the most contributed open source project in the world. We acquired GitHub and a few other things. So it's definitely a very fun journey there. I think like one of the things about Microsoft, and that's like the Microsoft fallacy, is that Microsoft inherently understands platforms and its dynamics, but also the fallacy for any kind of product at Microsoft is everything eventually becomes a platform, even though that it shouldn't be a platform. So like there's a tendency is like we need extensibility, we need third parties, we need ISVs to build plugins here and there, and really like what the customers really wanted and needed was just a great product that was crafted by really talented people. So I definitely think that there's a tendency there to over-index on platforms, but that inherent platform thinking and thinking about leverage and how we can apply leverage in other ways is something that I've really taken away from my time at Microsoft and apply to some of the work I've been doing after and what I'll be doing in the future.
So clarify my understanding. I think some of the takeaways I'm getting so far are in order to be ready for a platform, there needs to be some level of maybe internal validation or maturity around the vision and where you want to play. And also maybe a market maturation where it's worth it to bring in an ecosystem to help you cater to that long tail once the core value has been established for this area.
I definitely think a core prerequisite for you becoming a platform is that you have to have found your product market fit, and you have to identify really the business value and what you're trying to solve. If everything is just a generic platform with no core value, then what are you really? Like you're your facilitator, right? But for you to be able to build a successful platform and also to add value for the third parties that you eventually want to have in your ecosystem, you need to give them inherent value. And that value usually comes in the form of distribution, and that's distribution to your customers. So if you're trying to be a platform for day one and you don't have any customers, you really don't have a lot of value. And it's really like, if you think about like platform building and also ecosystem, it's like those things kind of go hand in hand, is that you need to add value on both sides. You need to make it as like incredibly valuable for somebody to build building on top of your platform and using your platform. You do that with like the core product you're providing, usually through valuable abstractions, a lot of functionality, etc. But you also need to make it valuable to actually stay in the ecosystem. And usually that comes in terms of distribution, monetization, really enabling true business outcomes. So that's why I think the typical journey for anyone is like single product, multi-product, and then platform. It's kind of more of an end destination where you start. Naturally, if you're building like a marketplace, it's a different kind of product you're building from day one, where your main value is the marketplace you're providing. But when it comes to like inherent nature, what it means to enabling other people to be building on top of you, you got to start with the core value or why you're here, right?
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. Talked about kind of the time we're in right now with generative AI and how maybe it's similar with the mobile revolution, right? And when mobile came around and we're seeing some similar things. One of the things that when I worked in mobile, I would experience is executives kind of had this sort of fallacy that, I use mobile apps a lot. So I'm going to be pretty good at thinking about the product strategy, or in some cases, even like painstaking detail of UX of a mobile app. And it's a bias we have that comes from familiarity using something that we think that we can be just as confident in our ability to design and build it. And then we got to see it again with APIs, right? As you started to make your APIs more publicly available. As developers now, we're thinking, hey, I consume APIs all the time, so I should be able to design APIs for customer consumption. And it's, with that hubris that we had looking at non-technical executives, kind of came back to us, where we made the same mistakes and had to kind of apply things like human-centered design to developers being customers. And so this is an area that you've worked a ton on. And so maybe let's even start on a little bit of history. How did you get into this, kind of back then a niche space, I presume?
Yeah, my short journey in life has been, I'm originally born and raised in Copenhagen, Denmark. where I spent my early teenage years working as a software engineer in various startups. And that was an incredibly fun journey. The first startup went bankrupt. The second one, we managed to sell that company. And the third one, we also managed to sell that company. So it's a very fun journey in terms of really spending almost a decade in engineering in various roles and building various teams at various stages, but also just being in the early stage of startups and acquisitions, etc. And it's really through building products and really typical SaaS products that I started gravitating towards platform building and the ecosystem dynamics. Back then I also done a lot of random things that has not been tech related. I ran a conference company for a few years. I've owned a coffee shop. I've done a lot of things that has really been gravitated actually towards essentially what is ecosystem and community building outside of some of the products and companies I've been working on. So I definitely think I've always had a natural gravity towards thinking in those kind of ways. But my journey in ending up building developer tools and developer platforms is really when I relocated to the US, and my journey was at that pivot from engineering management to really go to the dark side of product, work at Microsoft, Stripe, and other places.
You mentioned Stripe before, and we're a proud partner of Stripe at Integral. We've gotten to build enterprise payment platforms on top of Stripe. And it's an absolutely fascinating company and really maybe one of those flagships, especially when Stripe first came out, in terms of how easy it was to consume these APIs. And in retrospect, can, not very surprising compared to if you think about how delightful it was to use the early APIs to now the full-fledged platform it is. So what do you think it is about the culture there? What are some things that you've learned from your time at Stripe that you provide as advice to startups or other folks in the space?
I definitely think the original Stripe culture to me, and the culture I had the luxury to experience and being a part of for quite a few years, is really about a culture of craftsmanship and giving a damn. I think today, if you go to Twitter and search for craft and Stripe and Patrick, one of the co-founders, I think Patrick has a lot of great essays and talks he's been giving over the years. But to me, it's really about giving a damn at scale. And Stripe is one of the few companies that has enabled a culture of giving a damn at scale. And it's really about you asking the questions about, is what I'm building here truly surprisingly great? And at Stripe, we had this mantra of we are here to incorporate and build products with a surprisingly great experience. And that element of surprisingly great, what does that mean? It means that when you're integrating with the API and you make a typo, naturally you should have spell checking. We will spell check it for you. Or when you get make an API request and there's an error, we'll actually give you a meaningful error message with the links to the documentation. Something you didn't expect, that we can really raise the bar what that experience is like. So really that has kind of been a mantra of building surprisingly great experiences. And really we think about the kind of the persona we kind of been always been building for at Stripe has really been the discerning developer, the startup founder, the developer that really have the discerning perspective on quality, etc. How can we make them more productive? How can we make them they're happy, etc. And really continue to raise the bar. And my philosophy has always been if you build for the tastemakers of the world, usually that also means that you're eventually making what I call the gray matter developers also happy. That the most developers in the world, they're the gray matter developers building the business critical line of business critical apps of the world, but they are not on the most modern tech stack. They are not sitting on Twitter all day, etc. They're just here to build stuff. But usually if you care about that early adopter, discerning developer and build great experiences for that trickles down to the rest of the market. I definitely think it is kind of a long tail that you have to optimize for. You're going for the head of the tail, but really focusing on startup founders, really discerning developers have enabled us to kind of continue to push the boundary of what great developer experience is like. I should say that I haven't been at Stripe for a while, so really what I'm talking about here is my experiences being there, right?
Sure, yeah. And let's talk about I think I got to hear a lot about the giving a damn part. And now let's talk about the at scale part, right? And maybe it's good that you came in up from the early days, because there might be some things you showed up to, or maybe you were hired for, or you learned in onboarding, or you were given feedback in the early days around having something being surprisingly that delightful. So how does that kind of get put into motion for as the team grows and you keep maintaining that even at scale?
I spend a lot of time thinking about like, how do we measure developer experience? How do we enable this to kind of be more of a program? And ultimately, I think like developer experience in a lot of ways is really like understanding your adoption, understanding your reach in your community, understanding how do you manage like product expectations and how do you manage satisfaction. But also like, yeah, like it really comes down to like, I think that there's a few ways you can think about like product metrics in general. My framework I am using is really like, I think you can boil down product metrics into 3 different buckets. You can look at adoption, satisfaction, and revenue. And I think everything else is kind of a proxy of that. I think it's very common in product management that you invent a lot of proxy metrics. You invent a lot of like, how do we measure success for this feature we're releasing? But ultimately, everything you do to me really comes down to, am I moving the needle on adoption? Am I moving the needle on satisfaction? I'm doing this to kind of increase my revenue.
So let's talk about those 3. So
yeah.
Adoption, I noticed the thing that I found someone sent me was because I was talking about the mean time to hello world that we were helping one of our automotive clients with building. And someone saw that in a tweet or a blog, and that's how I came across you, actually. So that's probably one on the adoption side. So tell me maybe some more examples. Obviously not a one size fits all.
Boiling it down in terms of like, I think there's an element of like, adoption is really like your time to integrate. How many developers do you have, but also how long does it take on average for a developer to integrate with your platform? And here there's an element of like developer experience in the context of a company like Stripe is really about integration experience. In the sense that you make an integration with a company like Stripe, you integrate with the API, and then you move money. And then we kind of, the developer experience kind of fades away because you're busy running your business. That's the same if I'm integrating with an email provider, etc. Once it works, I'm kind of moving on with my life. So integration experience in this kind of perspective is really about like, how can you provide an experience that enables developers to have the fastest possible way to integrate in the most satisfied way while we're managing the expectations where we can exceed the expectations. And to me, that's really what it comes down to. So we spend a lot of time measuring integration experience and measuring what a Java developer integrating with this part of Stripe, it takes this amount of time to integrate. And as we were kind of like rolling out new abstractions, etc., testing with developers, we would see, are we moving the needle here on integration time? But there's also some integrations that are inherently just much more complex. If you're building like a marketplace, where you need to do money movement in a lot of different ways. Maybe you have a legal review. Maybe you need to figure out how you actually are doing fund flows, all those things. So here, like looking at just time to integration is not really the right metric here. It's really about like, are we also managing the expectations that when a user starts signing up using this product, that we actually manage the expectation that this is probably going to take you 30 days to integrate with all these other things. And the coding bit is just going to be like these 2 hours here. Are we setting the right expectations with the user and having the overall end-to-end experience being like exceeding the expectations? And then there's the satisfaction piece. Like once I'm actually integrating and I'm banging my head towards the goddamn APIs and it doesn't work, are we holding the developer in the hand to give them the right guidance, the right level of abstraction, the right level of integration into whatever tech stack they're using? They might be using a framework. They might be using another system. Does the tools that we're providing really fit into that, or do they have to work around them? And that's really where you can measure like traditional things like CSAT and NPS about like satisfaction. But I think To me, measuring developer experience is a combination of those three aspects. And actually, there's a lot of other things when you think about the full end-to-end journey for a developer, like going through like the community docs, like the code itself, the APIs, like what it means to have great developer support, etc. But when I think about like the core platform user experience, it's those three aspects.
You mentioned testing there a few times. And so a little bit more tactically, help me understand what that looked like for you at various stages. Were you doing shadowing? Was it interviews? Was it over analytics?
Yeah, like here I mentioned a lot of like quantitative kind of things. A big part of this is also more qualitative kind of aspects. It's user testing. It is doing what we at Stripe called friction logging. That is really about having a developer write down all the friction they encounter when they start trying to use your product. So it's really like a simple kind of recipe. It's like you have a Google Doc with a template and you write down all the friction or surprisingly great moments you have and you give it a rating. And really providing that feedback in a kind of concise format and sharing that with the team. Internally at Stripe, we would do that internally. I would be trying my sister team's product and I'd be writing a friction log to them, documenting all of the friction. And this is really just the mindset, if you're tying it back to the mindset of craft and culture, is that this is really about like product quality and enabling product quality at scale and enabling product taste and product sense at scale. So we'd be spending a lot of time really enabling positive feedback loops when we are building things, whether it would be with internal teams, colleagues, really early design partners, and getting them to kick the tires, provide feedback, write a friction log, yell at us that it doesn't work, etc., and really enable that product development loop. And I think that's probably where like a lot of it's a very common failure mode for teams at any size to really get disconnected from that product feedback loop and build things in a vacuum. And if you end up building things in a vacuum for a while, usually that means you will steer off track because you're kind of in your own echo chamber. So everything we were building for developers has always been built with design partners in mind, working directly with customers, getting feedback, tying it to like really like discerning developers that can provide us candid feedback and saying this doesn't work or this is
Right.
This is awesome, right?
And there's probably enough, like Stripe's got hundreds of thousands of developers. And so internally and as well externally. And so there's a lot of access to folks now that you can get the feedback and testing and validation. Now, what about if you're a startup or you don't have as much access internally or adjacently? What are some approaches you've seen or you've done to get in front of the right folks? And then is there like a favorite type of test or experiment or approach that you have to gain confidence or validation?
Yeah, like I really think like when you're in the early stages of you building your product, it's really about you going out there and recruiting customers. And some of the early stage companies I'm now working with is really about like the founder being loud on Twitter, is you going through your communities that you're part of to identify your customers and really identify those early customers. It's like it's always great to like be attending and speaking at events to kind of go out there and recruit your customers, build your following on various social media, etc. But also just like I think there's an element of like you don't like a very common failure mode is that you end up building something and you think your customers will come. Usually that's not how it works. It has to be the synergy, right? So you really need to know who you're building for. And usually the reason for why you end up building something is that you start with a problem. And that problem is because you heard it from a customer and you really want to work with that customer very closely. A key part of like the early days of Stripe that was before my time and really like the story you're hearing about John and Patrick is that they will literally be out there pitching and saying, we can help you with your payments. And if you want to use it, we will come to your office and we'll spend an afternoon integrating Stripe for you. We'll rip out your old payments integration. And I will integrate Stripe with you and make sure that you're great. I think that strategy is very, very viable even in 2024. is that you have to go out there and really demonstrate the value with your product. And if you happen to be based in a major city like SF or New York, you have a lot of your customers here. So it's really about like you coming out and doing like essentially founder-led sales. You want to like go all PLG about it. Like building developer tools and infrastructure is really like PLG. There's no other way in the beginning. Is that you have to go out there, lead with the value, and really like just integrate the product if they cannot do it if they cannot do it themselves.
What a cool story as well of the early days of Stripe there. Any founders right now that I should go check out their social media or community presence that you think are doing it pretty well?
Yeah, like I'm naturally biased, and I'm an investor in one of the companies, Recent, which I also mentioned earlier. Seno, the co-founder of Recent, I think is doing an incredible job, both from a community perspective and have managed to build a really large developer presence. But they're doing meetups and really doing a lot of things. There's also another company called Superbase, which I think has been doing an incredible job on the community front. I know the founders, and I have some of my old colleagues at Stripe that are now over there leading that developer experience work. So I really think like for developers is that, as I said earlier, like they have one of the best calibrated BS filters in the world. So it's really about like you leading with the value, and that usually means that you are showing and you're not telling.
Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.